special program, which we start today for the first time. I'm Vera Bühlmann, and I will say first a few words about the School of Materialist Research, the SMR School. It is an education and research collective that offers intensive study courses, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities in Skopje, the Department for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Techniques at TU Vienna, where I am from, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven, and it serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. And what we are launching tonight is the first of our special programs. Special programs just means that there is a kind of a research focus, let's say, or a motif, as I would like to call it, in the background of inviting a selected group of people to speak, to open up a spectrum, basically, about and around a certain interest. And the interest that animated this program here is one in, I would say, the notion of place with respect to the digital. No? So a lot of the work in the digital, especially in architecture, is involving forms of life, ecological forms, material currencies, we could almost say. And what we were interested when setting up this panel, which has the title about the architectonic body. No? So we call it Essays on the Architectonic Body. And the idea is to say, okay, if we are in such a complex life world with architecture today, how can we address from an architecture point of view this notion of the system and its relation to space? No? And how is it challenged by the digital that we are all exploring? So this motif about place and the body is important in that sense that the body had in pre-modern time, it was not reserved to individuals and to species and genera, but there were also the natural bodies, which were the elements ultimately. So how in antiquity people thought about fire, earth, water, and air was as bodies, but bodies that are distributed everywhere. And one of the interests, at least for me personally, is also to rethink whether there could not be a way to reconnect with the legacy of thinking about place, not only space, but also place in respect to the digital. So our first speaker in this panel tonight is Claudia Pasquero. She is an architect, a curator, author, and educator. Her work and research operates at the intersection of biology, computation, and design. She is professor of landscape architecture, founder of the Synthetic Landscape Lab, and head of the Institute for, I don't know how to pronounce this properly, Claudia, IOUD at Innsbruck.
The Institute for Urban Design in Innsbruck.
Urban Design, okay. Institute of Urban Design, of course, at Innsbruck University. She is also associated professor and director of the Urban Morphogenesis Lab at Bartlett UCL in London, and co-founder and director of Ecologic Studio, a design innovation company in London. Claudia has been the head curator of the Tallinn Architectural Biennale in 2017, and she has been nominated in the Wired Smart List in the same year. She is co-author of Systemic Architecture, an operating manual for the self-organizing city, published with Routledge in 2012. And her work has been exhibited widely. Among the places, the FRAC, Centre in Orléans, Venice Architectural Biennale, ZKM in Karlsruhe, Milano Expo, this was in 2015, among many others. Ecologic Studio, and I think this is going to be some of the work that you will talk about tonight, which will also be a design work, a concrete design work that you exhibited at the Biennale in Venice, if I understand right. So Ecologic Studio has in recent years completed a series of photosynthetic architectures, such as the Biotech Hut Pavilion for the Expo Astana in 2017, a project called Hortus Astana, also in 2017, then Urban Algae Folly Aarhus 2017, Photosynthetica, playing with synthesis and ethics, in Dublin 2019, and others. There is one term that I would like to pick up, which you didn't mention in your abstract, but I find it very intriguing. You speak of biophilic sculptures, for example, biophilic sculptures, and of course, living architectures, which is what we will hear about more in a minute. So the project that Claudia Pasquero is going to talk about is entitled BIT.BIO.BOT, Collective Experiments in Biotechnological Architecture. It picks up and starts from the question that gave the motif for the 17th Biennale, Architecture Biennale in Venice: how will we live together? The brief or the ambition of the project is: let's imagine an expanded notion of we to include alongside humans the plethora of complex synthetic organisms currently inhabiting our urban sphere. These include ecosystems of autonomous electronic devices, digital algorithms, many forms of plant and animal intelligence, bacteria, and of course viruses. From this perspective, our design practice of Ecologic Studio is the venturous exploration of collective sensibilities. That is our collective abilities at recognizing the emerging patterns of reasoning across species, materiality, and technological regimes. This effort results in an expanded repertoire of aesthetic qualities. Architecture's aesthetic, then, is now no longer merely inspired by biology or computer science. It actively contributes to the actualization of their disciplinary discourses within a reimagined spatial reality. Architecture therefore acquires its own transdisciplinary intelligence and as well as sensibility, which can be trained and cultivated. In the current design practice, Ecologic Studio deploys this sensibility to access the inhuman dimension of the we as we have defined it, and to enrich the perception of it. This shift has the power to expand the space of design solutions that one can conceive by re-problematizing given problems. Urban air pollution, for example, can be mapped as a fertile medium feeding living photosynthetic architectures powered by hungry colonies of cyanobacteria. These in turn can grow biomass for synthetic digestion into bioplastic design components. Even before providing solutions, Ecologic Studio thinks the fundamental societal role of designs and asks new questions about the known problems, the so-called known problems in the urban sphere we all inhabit. I'm looking very forward to hear more about all of this. The floor is yours, Claudia.
Thank you. So today I will talk about BIT.BIO.BOT, a collective experiment in biotechnological architecture. To discuss this project, but also this framework or way of thinking, I would like to focus on what has been our activity in the past year, which has been more connected to project. Oh, my presentation got stuck, sorry.
Maybe try to share it again.
I will try again.
Or is it on your?
Can you see?
Yeah, now it seems to be working well.
So I will focus mainly on the work we have developed in between research and practice with Ecologic Studio in what we understand is an exploration in designing the living. This exploration has been carried forward by my company, Ecology Studio London, together with the Photosynthetic venture that include the Synthetic Landscape Lab, Innsbruck University, and Bartlett, UCL. We are very much focused on practice-based research, and the consortium is founded by Marco and myself, Marco Poletti and myself. Marco deals more, is managing director of the practice, while I deal with the academic development and the relationship with our partner. There are key projects that we have developed in the last year, such as biodigital design sculpture that was originally commissioned for the Centre Pompidou in Paris and is currently in Madrid. A prototype urban dwelling originally produced for the Astana Expo in 2017 and now remain to the city as Museum of Biotechnology, and this our first permanent photosynthetic architecture. We work with the Future Food District in Milan, producing an urban algae canopy in 2015. And then we started to develop the photosynthetic curtain through the project we developed for Dublin in 2019, which got honorable mention for Fast Company. So this project on photosynthetic architecture, they deal for us with a shift from what we can consider the metabolically linear city. We try to understand how we can move from a metabolically linear city to a metabolically circular city. We inherited from modernity and modernism an idea of beauty, in our opinion, that reside on the white surface, on purity, and an idea of the city that still reside on zoning. This has, for us, segregated us and the urban dweller from some of the processes that are vital to the functioning of the city. Inhabitation and the inhabitable quarter is separated from zone and area of production and remetabolization of waste. In this way, it is also separated from our consciousness, our daily life, and our understanding. Often in this paradigm, we talk about regreening forest and naturalizing city, as if we could bring back a slider and fix a temporarily perturbed biosphere. But our aim is to try and understand how waste, bacteria, the dark side of ecology, can re-enter design, can create new systemic cycle, and how can we design that? So how can we redesign the urban sphere that at the moment create what has been discussed as waste, as pollution and pollution. But waste and pollution are not a black box, are not waste and pollution per se, are just a change in the planet metabolism. We cannot stop change, but we can read it, understand it, and eventually establish different dynamic. Elements that are a waste for human can become a resource for other organisms. This leads us to the Photosynthetic series, create new circular economy of information, matter, and energy to remetabolize city and balance carbon flow globally. Photosynthetica, core biological engine, are photosynthetic algae, one of the oldest organisms on Earth. This is a satellite view of the Baltic Sea. The green that you see here are algae blooming. The white dot is a petrol tanker boat. Microalgae are in itself not only some of the oldest organisms on the planet, but also a consequence of climate change. Algae bloom is a consequence of climate change because algae are able to nurture and feed in many organisms that are byproduct of our society. Then they overgrow. But what if we take the opportunity to integrate them, to garden them as part of our city, to create an alliances with these microorganisms so that they could remetabolize some of the elements that our city produce? We cannot clean the air, it's not possible to clean, but we can change it another time. We can change it, establish dynamic that we can read rather than passively observe. So with Photosynthetica, we aim at creating artificial habitat and synthetic landscape for human and non-human to coexist, to establish different interaction of cyber gardening. We have developed multiple prototypes that range from playground, like the one you see here, and I will discuss more in detail, to other public space organisms. One of the aims of our project is written here is to bring nature beautifully and efficiently in contemporary city, turning building into living machine that produce energy, store CO2 into valuable biomass, and transform the air. Beauty is a measure of ecological intelligence. Aesthetic value and spatial organization is an important element for us to transform architecture from a machine for living to a living machine, able to create a different meta-dialogue with the user and with the environment in which the architecture is embedded. But this is not only a philosophical discourse, it's a discourse that aim at interweaving architecture with science, philosophy, and anthropology. Photosynthetica is a photosynthetic building system which uses solar energy to remove CO2 and pollutants from the atmosphere and produce valuable resources from microalgae. Air enters from the bottom and recirculate from the top, transform, re-metabolize. The flow of microalgae and the air that flow through them transform the environment around us. It's not only applying a biotechnology to an architecture, but is designing an architecture that transforms the microclimate of our city. The one you see here is the urban algae canopy we developed for Milan Expo 2015. Powered by the sun, the algae capture and store CO2 molecules and air pollutant into biomass, enabling new circular economy of food and biomaterial. So it's not only about remetabolizing air, but it's also about interacting with some of the cycle that surround us. How does architecture and city really engage with material production and transformation? So the algae are at the same time producing biomass, and this biomass can enter cycle of food, biofuel, and bioplastic. So these are some of the experimentation on bacterial cellulose that we have developed in producing new material, bioplastic from the biomass and bioproduct of the algae, as well as filament for 3D printed produced by the biomass.
We are now so many, and our impact on the biosphere is so large, so vast, then the biological systems cannot adapt fast enough.
We have, therefore, designed inhuman gardens as a form of interface between multiple forms of intelligence, human as well as non-human, and between the built environment and the natural one. experimentation led to development of Ortus. Ortus is algorithmically related to the morphogenesis of coral and its relationship with exoxanthella, the microalgae that live symbiotically with them. At the same time, is 3D printed in bioplastic with as a substratum on which microalgae in biogel growth. It envisions how we can become all cyber gardeners, which is the activity that Mark and myself are conducting in this image here. Ortus was originally commissioned by the Centre Pompidou and is conceived as a set of pixels that you can see here in this triangular matrix. Each of them respond to gradient of solar radiation and algae growth. It was substantially exhibited in Tokyo, as you can see here, where was in the Mori Museum at the 53rd floor of the Mori Gallery with the backdrop of Tokyo. This photo is relevant for us because in a way it creates a relationship between a single prototype and the city, which is the type, or the urban sphere, which is the type of relationship we are interested in. We never conceive our prototype as a single one, but as a possible collective that contribute to the transformation of the city. We have been also for this project envisioning how larger morphology could contribute to the transformation of the city. This is Ortus Tower, which hosts, apart from microalgae, also bird nesting and other organisms. This is a view from the atrium of the tower, the morphology which again allow air circulation and transformation, and it works both with the material system in 3D printing, that a material system of photobioreactor made with lab grade pipe, which has been used in other projects. Our photosynthetic architecture has been deployed in different environments in terms of public realm and retail environment. The Biotech Hut, which I mentioned before, is 180 square meter, has been conceived as a demonstration of a unit which is able to be self-sufficient and re-metabolize the environment, but also demonstrate what is possible to do with microalgae. There is a science in residence inside of the Biotech Hut, which continuously use the microalgae that are harvested as a form of food and biomaterial. The Biotech Hut produces approximately 1 kilogram of dry algae per day. Up to 60% of this is oil and can be used as biofuel, releasing 10 kilowatt hour of energy, enough to power an average UK home. The second area of the Biotech Hut is the area of living and experience, where the user is invited to cultivate and become a cyber gardener. Also here you can see the user is invited to interact with a more convoluted spatial articulation of a photobioreactor. The Biotech Hut absorbs 2 kilograms of CO2 per day, equivalent to CO2 absorbed by 32 large trees, and is equivalent to a family-run urban forest. The third area is the area of craft production or the garden. You can see here the tank where the algae are harvested every 2 weeks, and the larger system of production with the lab-grade glass pipes. Chlorella contains 60% of vegetable protein. Every day the Biotech Hut produces 600 grams of protein, enough to supply the recommended daily intake of 12 adults, which is the equivalent of meat-based protein produced by the breeding of 8 cows. The numbers are not here to justify the presence of the Biotech Hut, but rather to discuss the shift I was mentioning before from architecture as a machine for living to architecture as a living machine. How number become itself material articulation and transformation, that you can read by harvesting data through sensor that we have embedded in the architecture, but also through the color and gradient of the algae and how they transform. And through these, we can read their productivity. These are some of the drawings that articulate the materiality and the infrastructure of the biotech art. Public realm and play, another prototype we've been working on is now 2 years in partnership with GSK, pharmaceutical company, and Otravin, their branch dealing with respiratory issue and nature-based solution for kids for the respiratory issue. This with playgrounds. How playgrounds can be in city can become space that allow through their architecture the interaction with the user and with the microalgae to re-metabolize air.
I feel stuck in the middle. Do I send them out to play in pollution or keep them locked up inside?
It's a major problem. Pollution levels are far worse at the child's height. They are more sensitive to the detrimental effects of air pollution.
We all grew up going outside and not having to worry about things.
I never thought I'd have to protect my kids from the one thing that keeps them alive.
As a mom, it breaks my heart.
I just want to play.
Microalgae are incredible organisms. And with our technology, we can use them to clean our city's air. We have gone to one of Europe's most polluted areas and built the world's first air-purifying biotechnological playground.
The uniqueness of this concept relies on the relationship between the architecture and the kids.
Have fun there.
The more children play, the more the algae absorb pollutants and clean oxygen is released.
This algae is what's taking the bad stuff out of the air.
The air feels amazing.
The key aspects of this project is to create awareness that it is indeed possible to clean the air we breathe.
This can't be the only way to help them breathe better. We need to do more.
So this playground was built in Warsaw last year in May. One of the main challenges with the project was really to discuss how architecture, its relationship with the environment, with the user, and with the microalgae, what was transforming and remetabolizing the air. Because, and that was not testable before construction, because at the moment, many of the stakeholders involved in the project, they still had the perception that we could build an architecture to which we would attach a device that will transform the air, which is not the case for this project, for Air Bubble. It's the architecture that transforms the air itself through the recirculation that is allowed by the morphology of the roof and the interaction of the kits with the aeration system. These are my daughter and my son demonstrating how it works. And having fun, which is one of the key aspects also of Air Bubble and our project, how through pleasure we can understand ecology, through fun, through beauty, through elements that allow us to read differently the world that surrounds us. These are some of the components, more technical. It contains 52 photobioreactors that relates to the solar angle and a set of elements where the kids can jump and increase the recirculation of the CO2 inside of the photobioreactor, as well as the roof membrane in EGFE that allow more ventilation. We had also a set of sensors that augmented the presence of air bubble in the space. We we're downloading data from Warsaw monitoring station in terms of element present in the air, NOx, PM2.5, PM10, CO2, but we were also monitoring the path of people and the element present in the air around their bubble and inside of the playing area. These are some of the diagrams produced weekly. Each week we will produce a set of diagrams that should be soon live in our website. We will have a data page where we download all the data from the different projects we have installed at the moment. This is the AQI, this is the World Health Organization way of measuring air quality. And so the gray bubble are the one of the area outside the playground, and the white bubble that are in the green zone are the one inside of their bubble. So each week we had a transformation and remetabolization of the air that was between 70 and 90% remetabolization of NOx, PM2.5, PM10. We have then was interest of our partner to build more of them, but also to create a campaign of sensibilization on air quality, and we have created a portable version of Air Bubble. This was presented at COP26 in November, and later, and now is in Riyadh, where we've been in the last 3 weeks. We're now back in London. This is made in TPU. A membrane 0.5 millimeter is made mainly with air, water, and microalgae culture. So a 90% of the architecture is made of ephemeral material. It contains microalgae. The more, again, you jump or interact, the more the microalgae, the photosynthesis is activated and interact with the solar field. Again, the case without fun, play, interact with pleasure. I prefer to call it. I don't like the word fun so much. Pleasure becomes a way of understanding the environment as well as ecological system. Again, here we have, now is in Riyadh. These are some photos from Riyadh. We have a set of sensors that monitor the interaction as well as the performance and the structural stability. I think I got stuck in my presentation again, sorry. My computer seems to have some problem today.
Is it maybe with the sharing?
Maybe, I don't know why. Maybe I stopped sharing again. I'm using a different computer than usual, but I didn't thought it would be a problem. Is stuck on this image for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Maybe if you close the program and open again.
Okay, now maybe it's going, but I don't know. Okay, let's try. Sorry, apologies about that. Zoom problem, I guess. So public realm and museum, this brings us to the BIT.BIO.BOT prototype we developed for the Corderia dell'Arsenale in Venice. As was mentioned at the beginning, the project it's about co-living, or how we will live together. In our case, we envision a way of living together between human and non-human. It was the exhibition was composed of three structures. The curtain that you see here, where the microalgae are inoculated. Our co-living was, of course, in this case with cyanobacteria. There was the area of the convivium or pleasure that you see here, represented by this table, where we had a set of 52 3D printed glassware, where we devised a drink food with spirulina that you could taste and experience. Unfortunately, we couldn't do the event we wanted to do at the Biennale due to the pandemic. Hopefully we will be able to do it in March in another museum. And then you see in the background the garden, the area of main cultivation of the spirulina in this case. Here you see Marco interacting with the convivium area, and this is one of the 3D printed glass that were inspired by the morphogenesis of the cell of the microalgae, and they were containing an amount of protein equivalent to T-bone stack. Here you see the three components: the convivium, the living cladding, and the vertical garden. The photobioreactor that were presented in Venice are part of larger research on photobioreactor. This is the biobombole in my house. As you can see, I'm from home at the moment. Maybe these are the problems with the presentation. The biobombole was developed by us during the lockdown. It's a home garden, home photobioreactor, where we regularly harvest our own spirulina and use it for home food consumption. This again, my daughter demonstrating. Commercial office, another line on project we have on the photosynthetic, and I think this is the line last on the photosynthetic project, and I will touch briefly on the deep green, is the biofactory, or vertical microbiological garden and indoor greening system. This was developed, this in particular was developed for Nestlé headquarters in Lisbon. We had a research project with them on the transformation of their factory, and the first test bed was built in their headquarters so that some of the byproduct from the factory could be eventually transformed and become in itself biomass that then can become part of some of their product. In particular, we were working with the branch, working with coffee and developing a new aroma. This is the view from the headquarters, and these are some of the visualization for the extended biofactory, whereas we envision that to connect their production line with a cyber gardening system where cultivation and harvesting are integrated. When architecture becomes capable of synthesizing resources, it is no longer a container, program, or function like in the modern machine for living, and becomes itself a dynamic process of production or a living machine. These processes has been explored also at the larger scale of the landscape and the city. This is a view of the Pagliasare Peninsula in Tallinn. This was the main brief for the Tallinn Biennale. Each of the participants developed a specific scale of the project. In this scale, we see the scale of the landscape. The peninsula of Pagliasari is an area in Tallinn where there is the wastewater treatment of the city, but at the same time is quite central, and the city wants to transform it into an urban park because adjacent to an ornithological area. Here you can see how the landscape was transformed in order to remetabolize the water pollutant itself and create a form of bio factory on one of the prominent area of the peninsula. This is a diagram that summarizes or compute is a minimal path that compute the existing wastewater network treatment of Tallinn, and this is how we envision to redesign it in a distributed system through the project of Tallinn BioCity developed with the Biennale. These are some of the visualization of the effect that this redistribution of the wastewater nectar and of the photosynthetic layer of Tallinn would have on the structure of the city itself in winter, and this is on summer. You see some of the network that materialize itself across. This project was simulated and developed through a collaboration, in this case, with Fusarium polycephalum. Slime mold, you might be familiar with slime mold. Slime mold is considered by many a next biological computer, as slime mold is able to optimize the redistribution and compute the redistribution of resources inside of its network. But which is something, or which is a process that many of our cities need to implement. But the way slime mold does it, and we can see here the slime mold computing the distribution of resources across the landscape of Pagliasari, is not through top-down master planning, but through bottom-up relational activity that happen as a form of collective intelligence and interaction with the medium and new place that are inside the minimal task that is here. This is a video of this simulation that we developed with Architectural Biennale for the Italian Architectural Biennale. What's interesting in particular is also that computation through the slime mold, it's not a question of abstracting algorithm, but rather becomes a question of cybergardening and interaction between multiple forms of intelligence. This is something that we have further explored through the GAN Fusarium, so interfacing Fusarium polycephalum with machine learning algorithm. This is a view of another part of the BIT.BIO.BOT and transformation of Venice. And we have currently developed an aspect of this project applied to Paris that will be presented at the Center Pompidou in a couple of weeks, and with which I would like to close. So this is the Gamfisarium applied to the city of Paris, and in particular this green network, starting from a scale of 10 kilometers and arriving to 100 meters. This is one of my favorite transformations, is the Center Pompidou, with the square in front completely transformed from the Gamfisarium. This, as I said, will be presented in Paris on the 22nd of February, and then will become part of the Pompidou collection. We are also working with UNDP at the moment to apply this algorithm to the redesign of cities in developing countries, such as Guatemala City, Mogadishu, and Baranye, and some of the findings of this research will be collected in our forthcoming book, Deep Green. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. This was very, very impressive, very, very inspiring. So we have time for some discussion, some questions. Perhaps we can see each other better if you stop sharing the screen. Great. Does somebody have something to start with? Otherwise, perhaps I can follow up on the latter part. It is something that I have been asking myself throughout. This issue of scale. How do you relate to scale with regard to the circular economy, to this cyclical processes and these processes of saturation? So how can we make scale work in a way that it can describe saturation, for example? I'm sure you are so eloquent in changing scales and going to all these different levels. How are you dealing with that? Can you describe a little?
Well, I think two of the main influence in my work, thinking and framework since the beginning, since I was studying myself, are on one side Gregory Bateson, Steps for an Ecology of Mind, on the other side the work of Frejotto, particularly maybe some work that is less known from Frejotto on occupying and connecting, the little book that discusses pattern on multiple scale and how the transformation of the landscape and pattern are correlated. So that's the way we work with transcalarity, referring to the last project. Of course, there are elements of, there are patterns that repeat a multiple scale, and what interests us is the fact that their aesthetic, their morphology, their behavior becomes an indication of their ecology. So in that sense, I mentioned Bateson in relation to Frejotto because for me, Frejotto was sometimes failing to do so, to recognize clearly the aesthetic value intrinsic in its work. So, and what it can contribute in terms of opening up at the level of understanding and communication, which instead it's described, for example, in Steps Toward an Ecology of Mind by Gregory Bateson in few chapters. I've always been quite fascinated by the chapter in which he described the embryogenesis of the embryo as a way, as a communication between the womb of the mother, and there are these flows of information that flow in and flow out. So you describe the embryogenesis as a chat at the bakery, basically. So that for me is quite fascinating, but I also, I'm a very visual person, and I also really think that visual languages have an incredible role in discussing ecology and political issues, and are really important, and are a vehicle of information that go beyond the one we can describe with the logical thinking. So in that sense, the transcalarity quote Frejotto, but also goes further with the interpretation of Bateson. So certain elements, of course, are transcolor, but we don't get the yellow from the slime mold, rather.
I mean, one aspect that I find interesting with scale is that one can, so we are very much used to approach it through the visual or through dimension and space, but there's also a way to think about scale from music, no? And from well, scales, then they become like keys. And I always wonder whether such a sense of keys, so scale as keys, that it's not language, no? It's a kind of a script, of course, but it doesn't mean much. it makes sound, and whether this could not be an interesting register to the cyclicity of these computational things, without wanting to say we need harmony. No, it's not about that, but about sounds. Do you have any experience in this regard?
Yeah, it's more well, the only project we have developed that deal with sound direct is the metafolly for the FRAC in Orléans, where we had this. We were working with this pavilion that made of 350 tiles. Each tile was a piezo-buzzer, and depending from the morphology and the interaction between sensor embedded into the architecture and the user, a different sound would emerge. So the user and the pattern of use will become pattern of sound in that case. But again, the question is the pattern. It's called metafolly, again, in that case, referring to Bateson, because the question is, how do we recognize pattern? How do we create a relationship with pattern? And somehow start to deal with dynamical process, not by in scales, not by looking at the specific geometry, but more at the tendency. It's really, I think, due to the fact that the last few hundred years are being dominated by a certain specific way of extrapolating numbers and identifying iconic object rather than looking at pattern, and how do we revert this. And I think visual languages have, but as well as sound or meta languages, let's say, could have a lot to say in this sense.
Yeah, interesting. Who has a question?
Yeah, perhaps I can ask something. So thanks for the presentation. And my curiosity was rather going in the direction of, I was wondering what is the role of ornament in what you do. And as I say that because you mentioned a lot, there was a recursive mentioning of beauty and also of pleasure, and I could see that, of course, in your work there seems to be, at least to me, a kind of you're looking into things into this kind of cohabitation between the human and the human that works, but at the same time that is somehow as a visible presence. No, so there's of course a design element. But I was wondering, how do you think this? Because, for instance, someone, and I excuse myself for the comparison, but someone, for instance, that seemed to work in a similar direction, but in my understanding works then it's profoundly different from your work, is, for instance, Stefano Boer, that claims through his building of doing, let's say, the same that you do, but I would say it's completely different than in the end. And in this case, there's really this kind of ornamental dimension of this encounter between the human and non-human, which does not correspond to a functional one, let's say. And yeah, I was thinking, how do you...
Without going into, I think one of the main difference between us and Stefano is not ornamental, but is the fact that we work computationally, and we have an interest in computational thinking, and we relate biological behavior to computational one, while Stefano worked more in a compositional manner. Of course, Stefano has done a lot of relevant project and has brought forward a conversation about ecology. I do think that without the capability of working in an extended manner with data that are both biological and digital, there are some limit on the capability of design to approach ecological issue. So on that, I do agree with you, but I think to a certain extent, but I think the main difference is that one, the approach. I think the approach of Stefano is mainly, although he has been expanding, working with few scientists in Italy on biosensing, but because the design method is compositional and our is computational, then the level of integration that the biosensing can have in the project is different.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But the question I think is a complicated one. No? How to think of ornament with the computation?
Well, ornament is a word. Mm. So the question whether morphology looks ornamental or it's an ornament is a different question. Yeah, ornament is a terminology we don't deal so much with. We often discuss the fact that rather than working with morphology, which is a catalog of static shape, we are rather interested in working with morphogenesis, which is instead the process of becoming of force through forces on matter, information, and energy. But therefore, we, as architects, we don't really argue for or against the ornament, because for us it's more about developing a language which is spatial as visual, that it's able to be on one side a vehicle of information, on the other also through spatial pleasure and therefore beauty establish a deeper conversation with the urban dweller. Yeah. So that for us is the question how aesthetic become a vehicle of a different level of communication. Yeah. This, of course, some project can be read as there can be an ornamental dimension, but it's a term that is a little bit outside our syllabus. Yeah. Yeah.
And thank you for the presentation. And maybe prior to the question of the ornament is the question of form, and you already briefly explained let's say your approach at the beginning of your answer to the first question. You also explicitly dealt with Fra Iotto. And so my question is about in your relation with Fra Iotto and Fra Iotto's, let's say, approach to form finding, and not, so in this sense, we can say already proto-computational. How do you relate actually with the control of the form when the process of form finding becomes computational until this very point of somehow not anymore acting actively on the form? How do you stop? Where do you stop if you stop?
I never stop. The question is, on one side, I think in the framework of form finding of Fra Iotto, there is a missed opportunity, because I don't think that analog models are pre-computational or post-computational. I think they are computational and that's it. So for me, there is an interest in interfacing the analog with the digital, and the analog is not a way of computing something we cannot compute with the computer yet. And then when we have with the computer, we dispose of the analog. The analog is the analog and the digital is the digital. They both compute, and I'm very much interested in dealing with both of them, eventually interfacing. They are almost two different forms of intelligence, we could say. Then in terms of morphology, the question is how, rather than fixing a geometry, how do you understand a behavior? So that's my interest, both at the scale of the city, that at the scale of the architecture. So how, as a designer, we design behaviors rather than static morphology, and how do we deploy the tool to do so? For me, I have, this is not really a theory, it's more of an impression or a story. I always had the impression that when architecture, the word architecture came about, we were in the Renaissance in Florence. And the tool deployed was the perspective view. And architecture in itself as a form of interface between the human and the milieu in which it's embedded is this fortress, this rigid fortress. But if you think about the social, political, ecological condition at the time, were very different from the one we have now. The relationship between the biosphere and the urban sphere was flipped around. The biosphere was wilderness, was very strong. And the architecture materialized itself as an element of protection. We are in an opposite situation in which biospheric forces are very weak. We can't even perceive them. And urban spheric forces are really wild. So maybe architecture needs to flip around this position and stop being a fortress and become an interface that enable a dynamic communication, that enable this flow to be understood, perceived, and discussed, you know, enable this relationship that at the moment it's rather weak. So for me, it's the position of architecture that is changed. And to go back with your question, I'm not so interested in fixing a morphology. I'm more interested in understanding a behavior. Then there will be element, you know, intensive forces and extensive one. There will always be elements that are static and elements that are dynamic. It doesn't mean that everything moves, right, to deal with a dynamic, because there are always framework and there are always substratum, but that's different than designing a geometry. You design the behavior and then you actualize it by designing and developing some element of your living architecture that are dynamic and some other that are static or different level of dynamic, right? Some element might biodegrade in 2 weeks and change very rapidly, some in few months, some in few years, some even more, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the strongest for me things in your work. This interest and this plasticity, almost of a sensorium approach to all these things. So it's almost like a kind of a sensorium of the rational, no? It feels a bit like it, which is intriguing to think with. Also, this image, of course, with the slime in the end, which organizes and hollows out. It's really about, I understand also intuitively perhaps from your work that it's about kind of inversions of balances and of proportions, like you now emphasized. No? So it's architecture is going wild. So urbanism is going wild. So let's sense it in a different way, computation. Mm. Mm. one question to also that I'm interested in at the moment is what to do with waste. So I'm very skeptical if there is a kind of an ideal to get rid of waste at all.
But for me, waste does not exist. There are just resources.
Okay.
No. It's our paradigm that produce waste. Actually, I go again very personal. Part of my family come from the countryside and produce wine somewhere in the north of Italy. And in the pre-industrial society, I would say that I witnessed where I grew up, there was no such a thing as waste. Everything was recirculated and was a resources. There are elements that are more valuable and elements that are less valuable, fair enough, but everything is recirculated. The production of waste is due, in my opinion, to the way our production consumption system is designed. On one side, to the fact that we can't witness any of the process and therefore we can't interact with any of them. So we are consumer of closed objects that once they are broken, they are just a waste. Once we take out what we need for them, we don't know the object. It's a closed object. On the other hand, our city has been designed in a way for a reason that I think were perfectly fair when this happened, but I think it's now time to change. We're designed in a way that all our infrastructure is blind to us. Probably one of the few buildings I know that expose M&E system is the Pompidou, to a certain extent, right? Till today, how many buildings, how many cities are able to create a tighter relationship between flow of information, matter, and energy, and the built environment, and the housing quarter? That's not happening, and that is again a missed opportunity. There is energy everywhere. I can create a catalytic cell by putting an anode and a cathode in the plants that I have above there and extract some energy. Everything can be recrunched, reused, recycled. The question is how? Do I do it because I need to save the planet? Maybe no. But can I do it because it's part of my daily life, my pleasure? Then maybe more. So the question is, of course, we cannot dispose of the city that we have, but step by step, how can we really transform it? And how can design and our habits change so that we transform our city and understand more and more the flow that surround us so that we can effectively reuse and transform.
Yeah, but there's a symbolic dimension about waste or pollution, which Michel Serres has described this very, very strongly. No, so when we take something as a property, so pollution has a lot to do, of course, with production and circulation and consumption, but I think in an even prior state with property. So it's like dogs which mark territories, no? Or if his example is, no, if you don't want to share your food, you spit in it, nobody will take it. so there's a kind of, at the one and at the same time, a very archaic and a very symbolic, but a very, very fundamental kind of relation between pollution, and that means also waste, and the status of property. And I think especially with the biotechnological paradigm, ecological, this question of property it's like, so it could, no, on the one hand, it's like everything becomes one big oikos, one big private house, but then who owns it, no? so who is allowed to, so yeah, the question of property.
It's a problem of terminology, because there is not such a thing as pollution, in my opinion. Or waste. There is just mineral in the air. The metabolism of the planet is changed. So what? My metabolism is changed as well from when I was 5 years old. So, I can't go back to be 5 years old, I think, and the planet neither. So let's look at each other and decide what we do with it. that's for me the question. The metabolism is changed, but yeah, there are political, ecological, and social implications on the fact that we are told that we are in an emergency and this is pollution. We are probably in an emergency, but then what do? Do we need to call this pollution and try to clean it, or I need to try and go back to when I was 5 or 20? I don't think that's an interesting proposition either. Mm-hmm. So for me, the question is, look at what we have and collectively and decide or take action, see also the opportunity that are there, because this transformation might have opportunity, not only emergency. Yeah. So that's the question. And the fact that this is named as generic pollution, it's problematic, because always the big boxes flatten what effectively is there. Especially air, the microclimate in the city change every 5 meters. It's in continuous flow. If we would just visualize all these particles, it would be so overwhelming because they change so frequently and for different reasons. And the question is not to switch on something that magically transforms it back, is to understand what it is, how it affects us, and how we can interact in one way or another by, just simply opening and closing the window and creating ventilation to having plants of different type working with bacteria and fungi. So that's...
Yeah.
And of course, computing and sensor and data allow us to create also an extra level of augmentation of this reality, and therefore interact with it with a different awareness, right? Because simply biology is usually a very slow case. So it's true, the color of the microalgae is information, but it's information that change in 2-3 weeks. So reasonably, I cannot stay for 3 weeks stuck in front of a photobioreactor to read the pattern, right? So if we have a sensor and data embedded into it, so we take advantage of this aspect of not simply gardening, but cyber gardening, then we can possibly have a different type of impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a stance which speaks strongly through your work. It's forceful, yeah. Are there more questions? So in that case, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation, for sharing your work, for giving us insights into this reality. And hopefully see you sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invite
so much.
and the conversation. Thanks. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks to you as well, Zach. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. See you soon.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.